We're having a discussion about mental illness, mental disorder. If you haven't seen the videos that we've already done, please jump on those and watch. But we're talking to Dr. Daniel Berger about this complex and it's a big category to cover, and that's why we're doing multiple videos. And so let's talk more about mental illness. Hello everyone, thank you for jumping on the video. I am Rick Thomas, this is Dr. Daniel Berger. We're doing Life Over Coffee with Daniel Berger and Rick Thomas. We have a lot of videos that are already out there, and I would just encourage you to jump on that playlist and you can watch all of those videos on a plethora of topics, and they will be beneficial to you. In this current series that we're doing, we're talking about this idea of mental illness, and the way Daniel has broken it down to us, we have this construct we're calling mental disorder, mental illness, and then we're looking at the three legs that actually hold it up. And it's important that when you talk about mental illness that you understand what this is such a vague term to all of us, and we want to understand exactly what we are looking at, and there's a way to do that with specificity. And so in the prior videos we've talked about this idea of lunacy and deception and insanity. That was the other word, and so we discussed that. But then there is another way, another aspect of this idea of disorder that could also be part of the equation as well, and it is impairment and distress. All right, so Daniel, what do you mean when you talk about mental illness as a part of it being impairment and distress?
Yeah, so we talked about the traditional idea of insanity, madness, and around 1960s, 1963, a psychiatrist by the name of Dr. Robert Spitzer, he was the chair of the DSM-3. So they were revising from the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. They were revising it to really expand. I mean, Bob Spitzer invented all kinds of new types of mental disorders. And what happened was the LGBT movement came to Spitzer and said, you take us out of the third edition or we're going to expose you. And it's interesting that all the leading secularists now actually use the word expose, like they were going to show us up and show us that we were just creating constructs and labeling people accordingly. And so they had a dilemma. They were either going to take that out, which in any valid field of medicine is malpractice, right? You're diagnosing people, not just diagnosing them, but electric shock therapy. They were the equivalent of waterboarding them and putting them in boiling water. They were.
You talking about gay people?
Yeah. So the LGBT came to them and said, number one, we're not abnormal. You need to cut this out, or we're gonna destroy you. So that actually caused them to remove homosexuality as a mental disorder, but they left in this sexual dysfunction not otherwise specified. So anyone who was still struggling, because there are a lot of people that do not want to be in this lifestyle, and that this is not well understood, but it's a reality. And so when they go to a psychiatrist, they can still be classified, but it calmed everybody down and also made it look like, okay, well, we're still having this category, but we're not calling it that. If you come to me for help, then I'll categorize you. And the criteria was that anything that causes impairment in your life or distress, if it distresses you, then it can be classified as a mental illness.
That's kind of vague.
Well, yeah, but it was set up because of this dilemma with the LGBT movement.
Okay, so you're just giving us a historical narrative of how we got here, how we got to this vague category of impairment.
And so to try to make this not as vague, they added in what is called the endurance or persistent axiom. So now it's distressful and impairing, but that it lasts for a certain amount of time. So the idea is that normal people, they go through distress.
Episodically.
They go through impairment, but they can get over it. So that's part of the humanistic idea that if I turn inward, I can find answers. Humanism then says if you turn inward and you don't find answers, you can't find self-esteem and self-actualization and self-realization, then you're disordered. There goes that box again.
So if you can't get over whatever it is that's troubling you and whatever unspecified time it is, then you receive a label of having a mental illness.
So from this came, like, for example, ADHD. So in 1902, as we've talked about, Dr. George Still called ADHD a morbid defect in moral control. That well defines us all. In the 1960s, it turned into a mental disorder that was looked at as biologically caused. So now, minimal brain dysfunction, as an example, one of the titles given to it. So now any impairment or distress, and so you look at ADHD, the construct of ADHD, 6 months. There's that persistence. Why 6 months, right? We've talked about this in a video that you can be linked to here and see. But this is essentially the distress and impairment axiom playing out. This is found on page 20 and 21 in the DSM, that they're literally saying anything that is distressful or impairing can be diagnosed as a mental disorder. We're seeing this now come about with what used to be called transgenderism. Now they're saying it's not actually the delusional thinking, so they're actually trying to move this from category 1, and they've moved it into category 2. So they're saying all of us should accept that a man who thinks he's a woman is now not delusional, that we should accept that. I mean, that's delusional in itself. They've actually changed it to gender dysphoria, and dysphoria means not happy, not content. So the distress of being a man but really feeling like a woman is the mental illness, not the delusion, if you follow what I'm saying here. So they've moved this whole construct from being a delusional way of thinking, traditional madness, to now being an area of distress and impairment.
All right, so let me see if I can walk through this. This is a book, right? By the way, if you don't have this book, you need to get it, Suffering Well. Shameless plug. I think this book is a cup. So I have a delusion. And so that's a mental illness on the first leg. And now it's not a delusion. I don't feel.
It just troubles me.
It just troubles.
It distresses me.
It distresses me. So I'm not deceived anymore. I'm just distressed. But that's a mental illness. So in order for me to not be distressed anymore, I need to change this book to a cup.
Right.
Or I need to go from male to female.
Right.
And then I'm outside of mental illness and I'm normal.
It essentially, if you are distressed in any way or impaired, and with the case of ADHD, it's actually not the child who's typically impaired, it's the teachers and the parents. So they don't say this, but it would include society. If society doesn't like, I mean, most people that are labeled as a narcissist are themselves pretty happy with themselves, right? They're not in distress.
What's wrong with
or
me?
impaired. It's others that are going, being around you is distressful. Being around you is impairing my life, you know. But they also are looking at that life saying your behavior is impairing your life. It's hurting you. It's destructive. So on that point, we would agree that the behaviors, mindsets, or the ways of thinking and our emotions, if they're destructive, we see a problem with that. God doesn't want us to destroy our lives. But they're labeling that as disordered or abnormal.
Yeah, but so at that point, sure, okay, well, you're feeling bad about who you are or what you are, but at that point, it's a point of departure that
Right.
that now you either go down the secular route, which would be transition, where you go through the transition process, or you go down this route where you get biblical help
Right.
for the impairment, for the legitimate struggle that you have.
Right.
And so at this point, it becomes the book and the cup is deceived. No, it's just I feel bad about it. Okay, we can work through it this way. It's like, no, it really is a book, and we need to talk about this.
That's
or
right.
Let's figure out how to change the book into a cup.
The truth will set them free. So that's true first and foremost with salvation.
And then transgenderism, as we're using as an illustration, it just creates more and more. And that's what the studies are going to. I mean, they're already showing that. Abigail
Right.
Schreier has an excellent book on this process where these
Absolutely.
8-year-olds are saying they have a mental disorder. They're impaired. They're not deceived. They're
Right.
impaired.
We're not being hateful towards
Right.
these people. You know, we're genuinely showing love that they do need help.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the greatest thing we can do is offer truth that sets them free.
Right.
Truth and love are not separate things. So
Right.
participating in someone's delusional thinking is incredibly destructive, even if you have good intent. And that's something that the world is not really keen on discussing. So anything that impairs your life, essentially, at this point, can be labeled and is labeled as a mental illness. One of the criteria for diagnosing many of the second category, and this is the largest category now. They keep inventing different things of impairment, distress, anxiety, as an example. One of their problems is that the Bible talks about us being in a fallen condition of vex. So, case in point is Psalm 90, verse 10. It says, the days of man are 70 years, and by reason of strength maybe 80, right? But his days are full of turmoil and sorrow. The problem is that life itself is distressful,
right?
Biblically, but experientially we know that too. So we're told that most people don't go through this, when in fact biblically we do. So there's a problem just setting up, again, anthropology to start with. So that's why all these disorders exist, because again, that false box of who is man has been set up.
So we're talking about mental illness. We looked at this idea of deception, which we've talked about in a couple of videos, and now we're talking about impairment. We'll wrap up here, but one of the illustrations I was thinking of as you were talking is that when my mother passed away in 2013, I went through what I call a blue funk. I mean, it was just like 3 months there where I was just under the cloud.
Right.
That I was impaired.
Right.
But it's at that juncture where it's like you have a mental disorder because you're under the cloud, blue funk, whatever you want to call it. Therefore, here's the solution for that. In my case, they probably would have given me medication, I would imagine. But I knew better. I knew what was happening. I knew I was impaired. I knew I was struggling. But I knew that God had a solution through that. So I went through this way, and eventually, I came out through that, and everything's fine.
And for some people, it's even longer.
It is. It's much longer.
And that's one of the problems with putting this persistent criteria on there for major depression, as we've talked about, is 2 weeks. Well, why 2 weeks? You gave testimony that it took a lot longer than 2 weeks.
And biblical counselors need to have, or disciple-minded Christians need to have the discernment that we don't want to create artificial timelines for what, and there's a wisdom issue there. I mean, some people really need to move on, but that is a discernment, wisdom, case-by-case issue. But we don't also want to make sure we don't truncate it or put an artificial timeline where we're pressing them in a way that's really just unkind. We're talking about mental illness, mental disorders. We'll do at least one more videos. I'm going to talk about the third leg of the stool is
things that should not be called mental illness.
Okay, so it's an invisible leg. It's clumped in there, but it's not really there.
Right.
We'll talk about it in the next video. Thanks for watching.